Two officers stopped him, assuming he was an outsider in their area. Mocking and ridiculing, they searched his car, savoring their superiority. But when he calmly revealed he was their new boss, their faces turned pale with horror. Marcos Bennett, a tall, powerfully built man in his 40s, leaned against his sleek black luxury car at a quiet gas station on the town's edge. His presence was commanding. Broad shoulders squared, posture steady, and a quiet confidence radiating from his every movement. His dark skin had a warm, sunlit glow, catching the day's last golden rays, while his eyes, sharp and attentive, scanned the scene around him with a subtle but constant awareness. It was clear he was a man used to being treated with respect, and his calm demeanor only added to his aura of authority. Dressed in a dark blue, perfectly fitted shirt with the sleeves rolled just above his elbows, he exposed muscular, well-defined forearms that showed years of dedication to hard work. His simple but finely cut jeans highlighted his lean, athletic build, while his stance reflected both ease and a readiness to act if necessary. His hands, clearly accustomed to both hard labor and precise work, handled the gas pump with steady precision, focused on his task yet alert to his surroundings, a man who left nothing to chance. Just across the lot, two white police officers, Peter and Steve, exited their patrol car with an air of careless confidence. Peter, young, with short-cropped blonde hair and a slight swagger, gave his older partner a look that said more than words. "Let's have a little fun with this guy," he suggested under his breath, his tone laced with mockery. Steve, seasoned and weathered from years on the force, responded with a wry smirk, nodding in agreement as they approached, their steps slow and deliberate, every move intended to exude dominance. As they drew nearer, their eyes roamed over Marcos and his car, sizing him up with thinly veiled skepticism. "Sir, we're going to need to see some ID," Peter began, a hint of a sneer playing at the edges of his mouth. His voice carried a note of forced politeness that barely covered the condescension beneath. Without hesitation, Marcos reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet with a calm, practiced motion, handing over his ID without so much as a word. His expression remained neutral, his gaze level, refusing to rise to the bait they were clearly setting. Peter glanced down at the ID with exaggerated scrutiny, eyebrows raised as though he suspected it might be a forgery. He shot a quick look at Steve, who had begun a slow circle around Marcos's car, inspecting it with feigned interest. "Nice car," Steve drawled, an undertone of disbelief evident in his voice. "Must have set you back a pretty penny. Are you sure it's yours?" he added with a smirk, tossing a sideways glance at Peter, who chuckled lightly, clearly enjoying their little game. Marcos, his face a mask of restrained patience, watched them in silence, his jaw clenched ever so slightly. His heart pounded with a quiet but controlled anger, yet his expression betrayed nothing. He simply let them continue, observing their every move with a steady gaze, his mind calculating, waiting for the right moment to speak. The officers, absorbed in their performance of authority, had no idea who they were dealing with. Determined to assert their professional vigilance, Peter and Steve intensified their questioning, their tones dripping with barely concealed contempt. Peter leaned closer to Marcos, his voice low and taunting. "So, pal, what are you hiding in the trunk? Weapons? Drugs?" He grinned as if he had already caught Marcos in a lie. Steve stood back slightly, arms crossed, observing with a smug expression, waiting for Marcos to falter, to show any sign of unease. A few passers-by noticed the scene. The patrol car, two officers, and a well-dressed man at a gas station, and began to linger, some watching with open curiosity, others whispering among themselves. The onlookers shared looks of confusion and unease, clearly unsure why the officers were interrogating a man who didn't appear suspicious in the slightest. One young man discreetly pulled out his phone and began recording, sensing the tension in the air and anticipating a scene worth capturing. Despite the audience forming around them, Peter and Steve continued, completely unfazed, their arrogance only growing with each jeering question. Peter sneered as he glanced at his partner, adding with a mocking tone, "These are the ones we need to keep in line. Think they can stroll around here like they own the place?" Steve responded with a harsh scoff, giving Marcos a scornful look, reveling in the power they thought they held over him. Marcos, however, remained an unmovable figure, his expression a mask of calm but unmistakable intensity. His gaze was steady, almost icy, as he watched them, absorbing every insult and taunt without a flinch. Inside, though, he felt the deep sting of humiliation, a quiet but growing rage smoldering beneath his controlled exterior. He knew that any reaction would only fuel their behavior, so he let the officers feel secure in their misplaced authority, all the while preparing a response that would shatter their smug arrogance. As the officers continued their charade, confident in their untouchable status, Marcos silently waited, knowing that soon their confidence would crumble under the weight of their own ignorance. For the moment, he allowed them to feel in control, letting them think they held all the power. But deep down, he knew the balance would soon tip, and it would be they who would feel the cold grip of reality closing in. Peter, brimming with arrogance, took a step closer to Marcos and, with a mocking smirk, gave him a shove on the shoulder, his voice dripping with contempt. "So smart, guy. You still think you can just do whatever you want?" His taunt hung in the air, thick with the officer's smug confidence. But something in Marcos's expression shifted. A subtle hardening of his gaze, a tightening of his jaw. His patience had finally snapped. Straightening to his full height, Marcos fixed the officers with a steely, unyielding stare. The quiet strength in his voice sliced through the tense silence as he spoke, his words carrying a weight that demanded attention. "You have exceeded your authority and violated my rights," he said firmly, his voice unwavering and his eyes flashing with resolve. "And I am ordering you to stop this search immediately, not only because it's unlawful, but because I am the new police chief of this city." The impact of his revelation hit Peter and Steve like a physical blow. They both froze, the realization washing over them as their faces drained of color. A sudden panic filled their eyes, their confidence crumbling into pure, unmistakable fear. Peter's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to form words, his bravado now replaced with a stammered, desperate apology. Sir, we didn't know. It was just a misunderstanding," he choked out, his voice trembling as he glanced at Steve for support. Steve, too, was visibly shaken, his confident demeanor replaced with an uneasy mumble as he tried to explain. "Standard procedures. Just a necessary check," he murmured weakly, but his excuses sounded hollow, the fear evident in his eyes betraying the shallow justifications. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, murmurs spreading as bystanders began to realize what was unfolding before them. Someone in the crowd quickly hit the record button on their phone, capturing every flicker of shock and terror on the officers' faces. The scene was electric with tension, a palpable shift as people realized they were witnessing a powerful moment of accountability. The whispers grew louder, spreading through the crowd like wildfire, as onlookers discussed this blatant example of prejudice and abuse of power, now fully exposed. Some began sharing the footage across social media, determined to make sure that this moment would be seen by the highest authorities. Peter and Steve, now fully aware of the potential consequences, looked around helplessly, the weight of their actions pressing down on them as they realized their careers, their reputations, and their authority were hanging by a thread. But Marcos remained unshaken, his gaze unwavering, as he watched their panic with a calm, almost detached expression. He understood that this moment would echo far beyond this gas station, leaving a profound impact on everyone who witnessed it. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was the beginning of a reckoning, a shift in the balance of power that would resonate far beyond the fear-stricken faces of the two officers before him. The next day, the video of the police chief being humiliated in a search by his own officers exploded across the internet and local news channels. The footage spread rapidly on social media, igniting a wave of outrage and support. In the comments, people discussed police prejudice and called for change. The case garnered widespread public attention, and department leadership had no choice but to immediately suspend Peter and Steve and launch an internal investigation. In the meantime, Marcos Bennett, understanding the significance of what had happened, made a public statement. His voice was firm and assured, but his concern was evident. "This incident isn't just a one-off violation. It's a symptom of the systemic problem many black citizens face. Racial bias is not just a mistake. It's a serious threat to trust between the community and law enforcement. His words deeply impacted the residents, and soon active discussions started emerging around the situation. Local residents, community organizations, and activists gathered in open forums and meetings to discuss racism in police forces and to plan steps toward systemic reform. People began demanding concrete actions, mandatory anti-bias training, transparent complaint procedures, and a new approach to recruitment. For the city, this event became a turning point. What began as a routine stop at a gas station evolved into a widespread movement for equality and justice. Marcos became a symbol of change, and his resilience and determination inspired many.